Genesis chapter 41 is where we pick up the story of Joseph. A few weeks ago, we continued the story of Joseph. Tonight we come to the conclusion here of a short little series on Joseph. Last time we talked about Joseph, if you remember, he had just interpreted Pharaoh's dreams. You see that at the end of, or in the middle of chapter 41. Just interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, but if you remember, he didn't just interpret their dreams, or his dreams. What did he do? He also offered some suggestions as far as how Pharaoh should respond. He offered a solution to the problems that the dreams presented. And as we said before, that was a bold move on Joseph's part, wasn't it? He overstepped his place a little bit by offering a plan, yet according to God's providence, it paid off incredibly. As we'll see here, Genesis 41, look at verse 37. So the advice, this is after Joseph has interpreted the dreams and then also has given his offer of a solution. It says, verse 37, so the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. And he had him ride in the second chariot which he had, and they cried out before him, bow the knee. So he set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah, and he gave him as a wife Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. Wow. Joseph interprets a dream, offers a solution to the problem. Do you think Joseph even thought that it would go that well? That all of a sudden he would go from nothing, forgotten Joseph in a prison, to all of a sudden being placed in second in command of all of Egypt, probably the world power at that time. Remember the last time that Joseph overstepped his place? He ended up where? In a pit, right? When he told his brothers his dreams. And maybe he told them a little too much. Maybe he was a little too forthcoming with all of that information, and he ends up in a pit. Well, here, maybe he oversteps his place again. He offers a solution, and it goes incredibly different. Pharaoh here really takes a chance on Joseph, doesn't he? Think about Pharaoh for a second. What does he know about Joseph? He knows two things. One, he can interpret dreams, and two, he has good ideas. It's about all he knows of Joseph. And yet, obviously through the providence and guiding hand of God, God leads Pharaoh to put Joseph in this position. What can we attribute that to? We've seen this several times through Joseph's life. We can attribute that to his character, to his courage, his determination. But all of that falls under what? The providence and favor of God. The providence and sovereignty of God, that without that on Joseph's life, he would not be accomplishing, he would not be where he is now. Everywhere Joseph has been, he has risen to the top. I want to show you here first Joseph's rise to power. That's the verses we just read, verses 37 to 46. By God's favor, Joseph, everywhere he has gone, whether it was Potiphar's house or the prison, he has risen to the top. His hard work, his determination, his perseverance, his trust in God had finally paid off. Verse 46 tells us that Joseph is how old? 30 years old at this point. If you look back to the time when he told his brothers his dreams, it tells us he was 17. 13 years have passed since the days of his dreams. He has been almost killed. He's been sold, enslaved, falsely accused, imprisoned, and forgotten. He goes from a pit to Potiphar, from Potiphar to a prison, from a prison to power. What a rise. Let that sink in for a moment. Who else has a story like that? Who else can claim that rise or that, that swooping down into the depths of great loss and great despair, as it were? He woke up that morning in prison. He goes to sleep that night in the palace. You see what just has happened here? He has power, he has prestige, he has position. He's second only to Pharaoh in importance. He has a new name, Zaphnath-Paneah. He has a wife now. He has wealth, riches, anything he wants at his disposal. He has notoriety. People bow before him. Joseph's problems were over. Or were they? Power does not mean the end of problems. In some ways, it means even more problems. You ever found that to be true in your own life, as maybe you have some authority or you have some opportunity and you realize, maybe I would have liked it just the other way it was. Maybe I don't want this power, I don't want this authority or these opportunities. Power probably challenges character more so than in maybe any other thing. Would Joseph still be the wise and honest and caring, righteous man that he has been? Or, as we often see happen, will power go to his head? Ever seen that happen in somebody? For the first time, they get that opportunity, they get that power, it goes to their head, and they wreak havoc. Think of the other thing Joseph can do here. He's had some people in his past, in his life, that he could go back now, having the power to do so, and wreak havoc in their lives. He has the power to do it now. Will he seek revenge on all those who has wronged him? You know what I wonder about this, and we're not told, so you have to use your sanctified imagination. When Pharaoh puts Joseph in this position of power, what is going through Potiphar's mind? What is going through Potiphar's wife's mind? You imagine for a second? Oh, that guy, I recognize him. And now he's the one we falsely accused and put in prison, and now he's second in command. Can you imagine that? Joseph comes to power, as you know the story here, and we're going to cover a huge chunk of Scripture tonight. So I'm banking on the fact that you know the story and kind of follow along with that. But Joseph comes to power here on the cusp of a national and international crisis. Remember, he has just interpreted those dreams. He interprets the dreams. His ensuing ideas are what get him into power. And now, according to Pharaoh, Joseph is the one tasked with Egypt's survival. Think about that. Joseph, having woken up in the prison that morning, is now tasked by Pharaoh himself, the world leader at that time. He is tasked with getting Egypt through 7 years of famine. Notice chapter 41, verse 47. Right after it gives us this description of Joseph and what happens to him, it says, verse 47, now in the 7 plentiful years, the ground brought forth abundantly. I get the idea here that it's not like Joseph was installed into power and then 10 years later all this started. It almost looks like, okay, Joseph's in power and the 7 years of plenty have begun. There was no time to spare. This was OTJ. This was on the job training, whatever that is. On the job training where Joseph has to hit the ground running, right? During the 7 years of plenty, it tells us here that Joseph gathered, he oversaw the gathering and the storing of all the grain in Egypt. Verse 49, it says, Joseph gathered very much grain as the sand of the sea until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. Remember, that was his idea to Pharaoh. Collect the grain in the 7 years of plenty so that you have it in the 7 years of famine. Joseph is the one in charge of collecting all that grain. During these 7 years, it also says that Joseph had 2 sons. Look at verse 51. Verse 50. And to Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God has made me forget all my toil in all my father's house. The name Manasseh means making forgetful. What do you think Joseph is thinking in that? God has brought him to this place now, and he's moved beyond the toil and the struggle of his past. A new life, a new season of life has begun for him. Verse 52, the name of the second son he called Ephraim. For God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. So he's forgotten the past. Obviously hasn't forgotten as in like he can't remember what happened. But he's not dwelling on that anymore. He's moved past that. And Ephraim here being fruitful, God has made me fruitful in the place where I am now. So the 7 years of plenty happen, and we see those in just a few verses of the text here. Verse 53 and 54, the 7 years of famine begin. Then the 7 years of plenty, verse 53, which were in the land of Egypt, ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come. As Joseph had said, the famine was in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt, there was bread. Do you remember in the interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams, Joseph said that the famine will be so bad that you will forget the 7 years of plenty. It will be so bad that it'll make the 7 years of plenty look like they didn't even exist. And here's the time when Joseph's mettle will really be tested. His first big test of power would be famine. His first big test of power is famine. Is he ready? Is he ready to lead Egypt through this? I would say based on what we see here in the following verses, the answer is definitely. He was ready. Think about Joseph. God had been training him in the down times, in the bad times. He had been training Joseph for this moment. This was not Joseph's first rodeo. This is not the first time he's had to manage something. It's not the first time a crisis had come into his lives. All the trials and the tests he endured. Think of all those times. Look in verse 55. I think this is an incredible statement about Joseph and his character and who he is as a person. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Then Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, do." What a statement. Here's Pharaoh, world leader at the time, and he says, whatever Joseph tells you to do, go to him. Whatever he tells you to do, do that. You realize what's happening there? That's a pagan telling people to go to a believer in God and find out what to do. Don't you wish there was a little more of that going on in our world today? Where people were told, go to the person who knows God. Go to the person who follows God and find out what to do. What power Joseph had here. And he proves here that he can use that power wisely. Look at verse 56. The famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, and the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So the people of Egypt, they run out of food, they come to Joseph for food. Verse 57 says it's not just the people of Egypt, so all countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain because the famine was severe in all the lands. As these other countries began to run out of grain and run out of food, they come to Egypt to buy food from Joseph. What a strategic position for Egypt to be in. I wonder if these other countries did not harvest well during the 7 years of plenty. Did they know the famine was coming? Remember, the dream was given to Pharaoh, and Joseph interpreted that for Pharaoh. The other countries maybe not know that this was coming. What a position that God orchestrates for Joseph, where he gives him the information that he will need during the 7 years of plenty in order to succeed during the 7 years of famine. Joseph here is passing his first test being famine. But the second one, I think, would be even harder. So Joseph's rise to power, let's look at Joseph's response to the past. Joseph's response to the past. And his second test, being even harder, comes quickly. His second big test under power would be not famine, but family. His second big test is family. Chapter 42, first 5 verses tell us how Jacob sends his sons down to Egypt to buy grain. They are out of grain. He sends Joseph's 10 brothers, verse 3. They went down to buy grain in Egypt. Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, lest some calamity befall him. That's important later in the story, as you know. Verse 5, and the sons of Israel went to buy grain among those who journeyed, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. They come down to Egypt, verse 6. Probably Joseph's biggest test. Joseph was governor over the land, and it was he who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down before him with their faces to the earth. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them. But he acted as a stranger to them and spoke roughly to them. Then he said to them, where do you come from? And they said, from the land of Canaan to buy food. So Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. Then Joseph remembered the dreams which he had dreamed about them. Joseph here sees his brothers come, and what does it say his brothers do? They bow before him. And immediately going off in Joseph's mind is what? Those dreams. 13 years, well, more than 13 years at this time, 20 years at this point. You've got the 13 years where Joseph rose to power, and then 7 years of plenty that have happened. They're into the years of famine, so we're over 20 years at this point, maybe even more. Joseph remembers the dream. Did you think that was in Joseph's mind up to this point? I don't know. You know, when Joseph rose to power, he's still thinking somehow that dream's going to come true, and God's going to, why would his brothers come down to Egypt? How would that all be orchestrated? I don't know. But when he sees his brothers, he remembers the dream. Now, do they? No. They had no idea. No idea that this was Joseph in front of them. Don't miss in all this the sovereignty and providence of God. Well over 20 years has passed at this point. How many millions of things had to be orchestrated to make this event happen? Think about it. How many millions of things in the world, in Joseph's life, in his brother's life, in Jacob's life, in Pharaoh's life, and you name it. How many millions of things had to be orchestrated by God to make this happen? How many actions and thoughts? How many conversations that have happened? How many events? You name it. How many of those things have to be perfectly aligned and placed in order to see this come full circle? Well, it has to be one of the biggest coincidences in history, doesn't it? Maybe fate was in action. Maybe just pure happenstance. No, I would say this is only the hand of God. This is only the hand of God. And as I've said before, you only have two options. You either believe that God is in control, or you can believe that God is in control. It's the only options you have. Either God is in control, or God is in control. You see it right here. I mean, it's plain as day. How can this happen? How do all those things get woven together but for the sovereign providential hand of God moving and manipulating all those things to bring them into the right place? The question here is, how does Joseph handle the test of his family? How would Joseph respond to his past? The sands have definitely shifted here. He's in a place where he can do whatever he wants. He wasn't in that position earlier. He is now. What will he do? Initially here, it appears like he's setting them up to wipe them out. Verse 7, it says he spoke roughly to them. End of verse 9, where I left off reading earlier, he says to them, you are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land. 3 times in just a few verses here, he accuses them of being spies. Verse 13, the brothers plead their case. Watch this. They said, your servants are 12 brothers, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And in fact, the youngest is with our father today, and one is no more. Don't miss that. Isn't that incredible? They said one of their brothers is no more. No idea at all that the one who they said is no more is the one that they're telling there's a brother that is no more. You believe that? Let that sink in for a moment. No idea of what all God has done. Joseph has information here that they don't have. It's incredible here what God has done. But how does Joseph respond to them? Verse 17, he puts them all together in prison 3 days. So initially it looks like Joseph is responding very harshly to them. It looks like he's going to get them back for what they have done to him. Verse 18, then Joseph said to them the third day, do this and live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers be confined to your prison house, but you go and carry grain for the famine of your houses, and bring your youngest brother to me, so your words will be verified and you shall not die. And they did so. So Joseph initially puts them all in prison for 3 days, having accused them of being spies. Now he relents slightly. And he says, okay, you don't all have to stay in prison. I'll keep one in prison here. The rest of you can return home, take grain with you, bring your youngest brother back. And so it tells us here that they left Simeon there with him. That's in verse 24. Now notice here, the brothers start to connect some dots, but they don't have all the dots. Verse 21, they said to one another, we are truly guilty concerning our brother. Who were they referring to? Joseph, who is no more in their mind. For we saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear. Therefore this distress has come upon us. And Reuben answered them, saying, did I not speak to you, saying, do not sin against the boy? And you would not listen. Therefore, behold, his blood is now required of us. But they did not know that Joseph understood them, for he spoke to them through an interpreter. And he turned himself away from them and wept. Then he returned to them again and talked with them, and he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. This calamity comes upon them, and their first thought is, we messed up a long time ago, and it's coming back to bite us now. You say, why does Joseph treat them this way? Why initially does he treat them and accuse them as spies? Why does he imprison all of them for 3 days? Why does he keep Simeon back, send them back home to bring back Benjamin? Why does he do it that way? I would assume, it doesn't tell us here in the text, but it's probably a test in some way to see if they have changed at all. Were they the same as they had been? Were they the same now as they were 20 years? Or has 20 years of guilt changed them? We'll come across that a little bit later on as well. From this point in the story, you see Joseph kind of this combination of kindness, but also questioning, also finding out more about his brothers. In chapter 42, verses 25 to 38, as you know, the brothers are returning back home, and one of them opens their sack and they find their money in the sack. Well, they get home the rest of the way, it tells us, the end of chapter 42, and they all open their sacks of grain, and they all find their money. And of course, they're thinking, what in the world is going on here? And that was one of the acts of kindness that Joseph did for them. Chapter 43 begins. They talk back and forth with Jacob. Jacob finally relents. He sends them back to get more grain, and he sends Benjamin with them. They arrive back in Egypt, and Joseph speaks with them. He feeds them. This is where Joseph arranges them by birth order, and they're sitting there eating, and then one of them says, look around. We're all sitting by the age of our birth. What in the world is going on here? And then chapter 44, Joseph gives them one last test. They're getting their grain the second time. He's going to send them back. And he commands one of his servants to go put his silver cup into Benjamin's sack of grain. And so they leave with their grain. They're heading back home. Joseph's servants overtake them. A silver cup is missing. They find it in Benjamin's sack. What are the brothers going to do? You see this here in chapter 44. They come back to Egypt seemingly guilty of stealing this cup. Not just one of them, but Benjamin specifically, the one that some of them had said, we would give our lives to save him. You can kill my 2 sons, they told Jacob, if you let us take him and we'll take care of him. Why this one last test regarding Benjamin especially? I think Joseph was again testing their attitude toward Benjamin. Was their attitude towards Benjamin the same as it was towards him over 20 years ago? Would they protect Benjamin? Would they leave him for dead? Had they really changed? Well, they come back and they plead their case and they said, we can't go back without Benjamin. We can't go back. This would bring our father to his grave. There's no way we can do this. And Joseph sees him. He sees the compassion. He sees the care. He sees their concern that they have for Benjamin and for Jacob, their father. And then in chapter 45, Joseph can conceal himself no longer, and he reveals himself to his brothers. Chapter 45, Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stood with him while Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Does my father still live?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. You think? Can you imagine what's going through their minds? Joseph said to his brothers, verse 4, "Please come near to me." So they came near. Then he said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt." What a scene. What a scene. What was the brothers' reaction? What do you think the brothers' reaction was? Terror, probably. Absolute terror. The one who is no more just told us that he happens to still be, and he's the one with all the power in the situation now. They would definitely get what was coming to them. But then Joseph shocks them. He should shock all of us by what he says. Look at verse 5. Verses 5 to 8 come right after Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. And notice the language Joseph says here. Verse 5, "But now, do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years, the famine has been in the land." So that kind of gives us a timetable there. These 2 years, the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. Those are some incredible verses, some incredible words by Joseph. God sent me before you to preserve life. God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth. It was not you who sent me here, but it was God who sent me here. Do you see what Joseph is doing here? He is processing everything through the lens of God's sovereignty. All of the evil that has befallen him, all his response to his brothers, he's processing it through the lens of God's sovereignty. And there's such a huge lesson here for us that when events happen, even when evil happens to us, there is always something more going on than just that event or just that evil. How will we process the challenges and difficulties of life? Joseph realized the bigger picture. Do you think he did earlier when he was in the pit or when he was in prison? Probably not. But now as he looks back, he realizes all that I went through for those 13 years have all been to save my family. He says, you didn't send me here, God sent me here. And God works in mysterious ways, doesn't he? We would never orchestrate a path like that for somebody. But God did that for Joseph, making him the man who he was, so that he would be in the right place at the right time to save his family. Now, he says similar wording to that again. Jump ahead to chapter 50. This is later on in the story. Look at chapter 50, verses 15 to 21. Keeping in mind what we just read in chapter 45, verses 5 to 8. Verse 15, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "Perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all the evil which we did to him." What's going through their mind? The brothers are thinking he's been nice to us because dad's still alive. Now that dad's dead, he's going to take it out on us. Right? He didn't want to cause more problems in the family. Dad's been through enough. But now that Dad is gone, he's going to take it out on us. Notice Joseph's response, verse 16. They sent messengers to Joseph saying, before your father died, he commanded, saying, thus you shall say to Joseph, I beg you, please forgive the trespass of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you. Now please forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of your father. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also went and fell down before his face, and they said, behold, we are your servants. Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. Joseph reiterates what he had said years earlier, that brothers, what you did, you meant for evil, but God meant it for good. And Joseph here says, I'm not in the place of God to punish you for that. Going forward, Joseph would focus on what God did and how he saved their family, not on what his brothers did. And he reiterates that in verse 21. Verse 21, definitely a testimony to Joseph's character. He says, now therefore do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Joseph here was in a position to either heal or to destroy. And what did he do? He chose to heal. There's a great lesson there for us as well. You know, vengeance, our seeking retribution, our seeking revenge on somebody who has wronged us. Vengeance continues the cycle of destruction. Forgiveness breaks the cycle. Forgiveness brings restoration. And Joseph chose to restore a relationship instead of make it worse. One more thing quickly in just the last few verses of Genesis 50. I want to show you Joseph's faith for the future. We saw Joseph's rise to power, his response to the past, and now his faith for the future. Look at verse 22. So Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. 17 when he had the dreams, told his brothers. 13 years of despair. 30 is how old he was when he rises to power. He lives to be 110, so he had 13 years of turmoil, 80 years of blessing and opportunity. And God uses those 13 years to make him who he was for those 80 years in which he was in a position of authority. He's nearing the end of his life. Look what he says, verse 23. Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the third generation. The children of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were also brought up on Joseph's knees. And Joseph said to his brethren, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. What's going on here? Joseph says, you will surely be out of this land at some point. God will visit you, and he will bring you out of this land, into the land that he promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What was he referring to? If you go all the way back to Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 and 14, God tells Abraham, your people, remember he's going to make Abraham into a great nation, but he tells him there's going to be a point in time when your people are enslaved in Egypt. They're in a land that's not theirs. And they're going to be there for a time, and then I will bring them out. You see what Joseph is doing here? He's looking back and he's saying, God has said this. And so based on what God has said in the past, I want you to do this in the future. He asked them, when you come out of Egypt, not knowing which generation that would be, not knowing who that would be, when you come out of Egypt, when you leave, take my bones with you. Take my bones with you. Joseph knew God's words in the past, so he knew what to expect for the future. There's hope for us there as well. There's blessing there for us as well. Now, why did Joseph insist on his bones being taken out of Egypt? What gives there? Why does that matter? What's going on there? Why does it matter where his bones are? Because no matter how successful Joseph was in Egypt, it was not his home. They were not his people. He belonged with the covenant people of God. There's a lesson there for us as well. This world, not our home. We're just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue, right? This world is just, this is not our home. This is not the end. No matter how successful we may be here, we do not belong here. Our citizenship, Philippians 3:20 says, is not here. It's in heaven. It's in glory. We belong to God's people now. We belong with God's people forever. And Joseph here gives us a great illustration of that. He says, this isn't my home. These aren't my people. When you die, and it was many generations, 400 years they're in Egypt, right? So the people he told that to had to pass it down to people who had to pass it down to people who had to pass it down that said, when we get out of here, which God said they would, we got to take his bones. We got to remember his bones. You want to know the rest of the story? Did they actually do it? Did they take his bones? Exodus 13, verse 19, 400 years later, it says, Moses remembered the oath to Joseph, and they carried Joseph's bones out of Egypt. Joseph's story did not start in Egypt, nor does it end in Egypt. But Egypt was a huge part of Joseph's story where God made him the man that he was. As I study this, and I've studied Joseph's story before, it's just incredible. Probably one of the greatest evidences of the providence and sovereignty of God in all of Scripture. As you remember, I've said this a couple times, providence is the hand of God and the glove of human events. And you see God's providence in Joseph's story. You also see, as we pointed out a few times, God's presence where he was with Joseph all that time. You see God's power. All three of those have to work together. His providence, his presence, and his power. All three of those come together in Joseph's story. But you know what? It's not just Joseph. It's not just a Bible character thing. It's not just Joseph, some great guy. All three of those come together and are necessary for us in our life as well. The providence, the presence, and the power of God. All three of those are at work in our lives just like they were for Joseph. Do you believe that? Do you believe that the providence, presence, and power of God is at work in us, just like it was in Joseph? If so, then don't be fearful, be faithful. If so, go forward. I love our song of the month that we've been singing this month. It talks about God's providence, his presence, and his power. It says, the one who made the heavens made my heart and soul. Before I drew a breath, I was loved and known. I am his creation, the maker's masterpiece, and all that he designs will be done in me. I belong to the Lord, I am not my own. I will honor him, for this I know. I belong to the Lord, I am not my own. God is in control. Let's pray.